Thanks for listening to the Archbridge Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wilterdink, and today I'll be talking with Justin Callais and Vincent Geloso. Justin is a Ph.D. student in agricultural and applied economics at Texas Tech University, a research fellow with the Archbridge Institute, and a research assistant at the Free Market Institute. Vincent is a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute and assistant professor of economics at George Mason University. The two are co-authors of the 2021 paper for the Fraser Institute, Economic Freedom Promotes Upward Income Mobility. The paper we'll be discussing a bit more today, among other topics. Justin, Vincent, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us on.
It's a pleasure.
Great. Well, just to kind of kick things off and get started, the paper that you guys released I thought was pretty interesting, but it was also a little bit technical, I think, for kind of most lay readers. But basically, you show that economic freedom is, I don't know if it's correlated, associated. Maybe you guys can explain the exact connection with upward economic mobility, or income mobility, I should say. So can you explain sort of basically that what you studied and sort of what the key findings were to kind of get us kicked off here?
Justin, if you don't mind, I'll take it and I'll let you have the next one.
Sure.
The reason why we believe it's related is largely due to the fact that effort in different societies will be conditional on whether or not you can appropriate the gains of effort. So that basically means, do you have, once you've invested hours, time, energy, resources into doing a particular task, you are doing this task in function of the profits it yields. But are these profits going to be secure? Is the government going to be able to seize them? Are they going to seize a large portion of them? Are you able to put them in property in forms of properties that will be respected and secure? If you have a highly secure set of property rights, which is probably the most important component of economic freedom, when you have those, the result will be that people will make the investments. There will be chances at upward mobility for people at the bottom because they're guaranteed that if they succeed, it is going to be theirs. So it is important just for that reason, because it motivates effort and it has this kind of added advantage that you can overcome your initial conditions, whereas a rich person would have the advantage of birth plus little cost due to that probably his resources allow him to actually secure his property through hiring security guards, or I'm using examples here, or expending his own resources. The poor person doesn't have that option. In countries with safe property rights and thus high economic freedom, there's greater chances at upward mobility as a result.
I think that's a really interesting and kind of an unexpected avenue for an answer than what I had expected. Typically when I think about this, you sort of outline kind of a case for incentives, which I think makes a lot of sense. I probably would have emphasized a bit more on the efficiency angle of economic freedom in terms of, mutually beneficial voluntary trade, agreements. Do you think that those two are in tension, or do you think that they kind of go hand in hand, or is there a way in which those are kind of the same thing, sort of the economic efficiency that economic freedom provides, but also this, the core incentive piece that you talk about too?
Justin, you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. So going off of that, I think that's an interesting point that you mentioned there, Ben, in that we know that economic freedom, and there's been tons of studies that work on it that have shown that economic freedom is improving a bunch of different outcomes, things like subjective well-being as well as just living standards, health outcomes. So I think to an extent they indirectly go hand in hand to what you're talking about. But I think for the purposes of this paper, I would side more on what Vincent said in terms of the direction of being able to have the options or the choices available, because you have choices that are put into you at birth, choices that affect your potential outcomes based on what kind of situation you grew up in, your parents' income, your parents' education levels, what kind of things did they teach you. But we also have these institutional constraints that we look at, and this is mainly in terms of economic freedom, meaning economic freedom is lowering those constraints, meaning that there's more opportunities to potentially grow. So I think indirectly they certainly go hand in hand.
No, just to build up on something Justin just tangentially said, there's also the aspect of barriers to entry. Regulations tend to be tilted against entry in certain industries or sectors. You can think about, in my case, it doesn't really apply, hairdressing. So there's regulation that prevent entry very easily into that sector, but that is an example of a regulation that would fall most heavily on people at the bottom of the income ladder. So regulations also would work against people deploying efforts into, say, increasing their human capital by acquiring a skill, or by starting a business and investing capital in it if they're in a heavily regulated sector, and the goal of the regulation is to deter entry and thus protect incumbents. That would have an extra effect to the ones I mentioned on property rights, which is that, A, there'd be more chances for entrepreneurial activity from the bottom of the income ladder, but it would also mean that people at the top of the income ladder, by virtue of being incumbents, are not protected by virtue of being incumbents in the field. They can be threatened by competition, and I think that is really important, much more than not much more, but equally to the property rights argument that we built up from.
Yeah, I think that's really an important dynamic that we see in a lot of different sectors. You know, I think Justin will have to take the lead on the hairdressing stuff for the two of us, but we'll take his word on it. I think we see that pattern in a lot of different places, and I think maybe that's something that we can kind of come back to a bit, because in terms of effort and motivation, my inclination would be to think, well, if the incumbents could gain, they stand a lot to gain from restricting that entry, right? Versus the, maybe would-be entrepreneurs, they potentially have a lot to gain, but it's not as realizable to them, or maybe it's not as concrete, as some of the gains that the incumbents have in terms of their motivation for keeping those barriers in place. So I think that is certainly an interesting dynamic. We kind of have that concentrated benefits, diffuse cost dynamic going on there, and that certainly can affect the motivations that are in play. And, okay, so you could feel free to respond to that. I spent a little more time talking about that than I wanted, but...
Oh, well, I guess on this point, I think that's to kind of build off of this point that you're saying there, is that the incumbents certainly have a lot to gain of this, right? If we think of a state, I'm from, Louisiana, is the only state to require licenses for a florist. And, thorns on roses are very, prickly, and they could hurt you, but I don't know if that's... There's a lot of gains to be had from current florists, and there was actually a bill while I was in undergrad in Louisiana that tried getting rid of these florist regulations, and tons of florists showed up to the legislative branch and was basically protesting, or at least arguing for why these regulations needed to stay in. So there is definitely a lot to gain from putting these barriers in place. So there's definitely a public choice aspect to this as well. And on the flip side of who is it harming, it's most certainly going to harm those at the bottom. If we think of hairdressers, which have to spend a few $1,000s on license laws and schooling, as well as spending, losing about 6 months worth of income just to go through the actual education of obtaining these licenses. Those who are at the bottom of the income ladder can't afford to do that. Their opportunity cost of the income that they could earn otherwise is just too high for them to go through these difficulties. So yeah, it's definitely on both sides. There's a very real reason as to why people try to protect these barriers and make all sorts of arguments for wanting to keep them in place. But they're most certainly harming those at the bottom the most by doing so.
Yeah.
So it's worth also pointing out that there's a work by Diana Thomas and Dustin Chambers in Public Choice, and what they did was look at who pays the burden of regulation along the income ladder. And what they found was two things. The first one was that if you look at the effect of product regulation, for example, the prices that are increased in greater proportion for goods that figure more prominently in the consumer basket of poorer workers. The second finding is that wages that are most affected adversely by regulations tend to be those of unskilled, low-skilled, or semi-skilled workers, whereas people in supervisory positions, people with higher levels of skills, appear to be less affected by regulation on average, suggesting that the burden of regulation falls on the poor, both in the form of lower nominal wages, but also lower real wages because the price of what they consume are increased disproportionately.
Yeah. And so I think that distributional analysis makes a lot of sense in this context to look at, because I think, maybe, a critic could say, well, the consumers are paying higher prices, and because they're artificially restricting supply of, potential competitors in this market, but that's made up by the fact that these, protected incumbents can now increase their own income artificially. And so, we're sort of keeping everything equal. It's just, the richer, relatively better off incumbents are capturing that premium from the poor people who have fewer options. But I think, so that there is that dynamic going on, but there's also a deadweight loss occurring here, right? Too, in addition to that. So it's not just about an income transfer from poorer people to these relatively better off, wealthier incumbents. There's also, overall, there's a cost to keeping these types of things in place. Do I have that right?
Yes. So there would be a negative effect on economic activity as a whole from these regulations. But the point we seek to emphasize is that the deadweight laws that you are describing, a part of it would come from consumers being hurt to some degree, and also from producers being hurt the most. But the reallocation is much more important as a discussion here, because if we're concerned about economic growth in the long run, and what happens is that these regulations tend to limit the ability of resources that people who are poor can invest in the future, right? So that means that they have a tighter intertemporal budget constraint, essentially. It means that they can make fewer investments in their own skills. They can make fewer investments in their businesses, which means that they have fewer chances in future periods from increasing. So there's a hidden cost that is harder to see, that the deadweight loss doesn't capture in full when you just look at that. So yes, there is like a cost to society of regulation, but in the long run, the cost of regulation is also the fact that the poor will labor under tighter constraint than the rich, which means that they will have fewer options, that they will not be able to invest in assets that would be normally very productive, which would be either assets like their own skills or assets like in their businesses, so their businesses don't grow to be the size they could be and thus produce more output for society as a whole. So the cost in terms of lost mobility from hurting the poor by limiting their chances at making these investments are much more important than we realize. And that's the point me and Justin are trying to push forward, is that there is always an effect of inequality. I mean, by virtue of birth, some people do get some privileges, but the level of economic freedom, which means safe property rights, low regulation, relatively low taxation, will have this effect of offsetting the adverse consequences of inequality on upward mobility. You would get more income mobility in free societies relative, all else being equal, to unfree societies.
Okay, that's a really good point. I'm glad you highlighted that, because I think a lot of our listeners would probably be a bit more familiar with kind of the objections that I articulated, which are kind of a bit more abstract, a bit more focused on the whole economy. And I think that bringing in that dimension of, it actually costs more in terms of lost mobility for people who are poorer down on the income scale is something that I haven't heard argued for in a lot, and I'm fairly familiar with some of this literature, so I'm glad that you brought that up. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics here about economic freedom. So, Vincent, you just identified, maybe 3 or 4 different categories that sort of form the core of what you mean when you say economic freedom. So, property rights obviously is a key component of that. Can you explain, basically give us a broader overview of, when you say economic freedom in the context of this conversation and this study, what exactly goes into that definition?
So yes, on this point, I guess if we want to talk specifically about the property rights aspect, if I understand your question correctly, that you're kind of wanting to know, specifically what within this legal system's property rights part are we talking about, as well as regulations, which a different...
That would be helpful.
Okay.
Or other components of economic freedom that you're looking at in addition to the property rights.
Okay, so for the purposes of our paper, we use the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index, and they have 5 different areas. They have size of government, which just measures how much is government spending, how much taxes are they taking, do they have state-owned enterprises, things like that. We also have legal systems and property rights, which is one that me and Vincent have been focused on a lot so far. On this is things like judicial independence. Are courts impartial? Basically, can you not, if you have some sort of political connection, can you get your way out of a certain lawsuit or a federal case? Just basic protections of property rights. Are those rights protected? If you own something, are you not worried that the government is going to come take it, or if someone else takes it, that you can actually sue them and get compensated back for what was stolen? As well as things just kind of in general legal system integrity. Do people tend to trust the legal system as being impartial? And reliability of police or legal enforcements of contracts, aspects like that. Area 3 that Fraser has is sound money, which just measures things like inflation and how kind of sound. I guess it's pretty self-explanatory in the name, but for the purposes of our paper, the sound money aspect doesn't really have too much impact on social mobility. But then the last 2 areas come into play a little bit here in terms of free international trade. So are there not tariffs and trade barriers and controls on the movement of people and capital? Basically, just free trade. Can you freely trade with other countries in the world? And finally, the aspect that we've also been talking about a bit here is regulation. So this would be parts about credit market regulation, labor market regulation, business regulations. Basically, our businesses, are there not unnecessary burdens being put on businesses in order to make the decisions that they think is best for their own venture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I appreciate. Yeah.
So just to add to what Justin's saying, the ones I think we consider to be the most important, especially in an international sense, will be property rights. So because there is much more variations in property rights across countries than you'll find in other dimensions of property rights, and also because each of the other dimensions probably do not matter as much for upwards mobility. Not that they don't matter. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is property rights are probably going to be taking the lion's share of this. So just to give you an example, in an unrelated paper to the one we're discussing, I took economic freedom measure, but at a sub-national level, so that'd be provinces in Canada, and we checked what was happening to income mobility according to different components of the labor of the economic freedom index. And in Canada, there's very little variations in property rights across provinces, so it's not even included in the index. And what we found is that the only component that packed any form of a wallop in terms of the effect was regulations. So that's the other one we think is a big deal. Regulations will matter in all countries in terms of promoting or hindering mobility. But the ones that will matter most in a global sense will be property rights. So these are the ones we emphasize the most as being like crucially relevant.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and that kind of hints at the next question I had was, whether you guys were looking at some of this stuff on a more of a global sort of, looking at it between countries, or how detailed and, how far down this analysis would go? So I guess I would ask, first of all, in this particular study, were you looking at cross-national comparisons, like a global comparison? And then kind of following up on that, would you expect the trends that you've identified to kind of continue down more to the state and local level? Or do you think that sort of falls off in relevance?
So I'd say yes, that you expect that. So what we did in the paper was we used a cross-section of countries. Right now, me and Justin were doing another paper, which is using cross-sections, but at multiple points in time. So essentially a panel. And we find roughly similar results. And in this case, what we find is that it's largely driven by property rights and regulation. But that also seems to work given the other paper, and that one's not with Justin. My apologies, Justin. I like working with you, but there's just so much work to be done that I just keep rushing ahead. So anyways, so in that other paper, we used Canadian evidence because there's good data sets for Canada on income mobility that is easy to access and easy to match with the economic freedom measures. And what we found was using all the data since 1982, income mobility was positively affected by the overall index of economic freedom. But most of that effect was driven by labor market regulations. So the freer the labor market, the more mobility you had in terms of income. But for Canada, it was not because there's different types of mobility. That I think is something we should mention. In our Fraser paper, we used two data sets of mobility. One is intergenerational mobility. The other one was a social mobility index that had multiple components. The Canadian data I'm using is using short-run income mobility, but for the same people, not over generations. So the generations is generally comparing income of parents with the income of their kids. The social mobility index measures this was produced by the World Economic Forum. It had some arbitrary components in it. We weren't super fond of it because it was not an objective measure. There was some subjective components of it. But in fact, the subjective components worked against us. They actually were components that actually would suggest that if we could use objective measures, we'd actually get even more stronger effects than what we find. So these are generally the measures that are available. And across the board, the ones that always pop out as positive is regulation, both internationally and subnationally. But once you're in a high property rights country, like say Canada, then the effect of property rights, since there's very little variation, there's very little of it that pops up. In rich countries, if you want to increase income mobility, the lion's share of the action will be found on removing barriers to entry in certain professions, in deregulating labor markets, in opening up competition, in terms of business activity. These would matter much more in rich countries. For poor countries, property rights seem to getting good property rights matter a lot.
Sure.
For a rich country, the action is in regulations. And in deregulations.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, just intuitively. And just, to clarify one thing you said, Vincent, when you were looking at intergenerational mobility, were you looking at relative economic mobility or absolute economic mobility when you looked at those metrics?
So when the income mobility is measured intergenerationally, the statistical way it's determined is that we calculate an elasticity. The elasticity accounts for the level of economic growth you have between generations. So what you find is, what is the chance that, so it could be that you get like an income growth just because incomes for everyone are growing. But it doesn't mean that you are escaping your relative position in society. That means that you were born in the first centile, everybody gets 10% increase, you still get you're still in the first centile at the end, right? So you haven't moved down, you haven't moved up. Well, if you're in the first centile, you're clearly not moving down, but you're not moving up in any meaningful sense. So the intergenerational mobility measures yes, they concentrate on relative mobility. And what we find in our paper, so the one we're the second one we're discussing, not the Fraser Institute one, what we found is that people went up the income ladder. That meant that people who were born in low income household get to be either middle income or high income households. So they're basically, their parents' condition is not foisted upon them forever, essentially, is what we find. Okay.
Yeah, that definitely answers that question. And so to kind of recap, we can kind of step back for a minute there. Just let me see if I'm getting this right, and you guys can correct me if I've missed something. But you're kind of saying that more on like a global scale, property rights is really sort of the bedrock foundation that you need for the kind of economic growth and income, upward income mobility that we'd want to see, especially for poor people. And then once you kind of reach that minimum threshold of securing those property rights, like many of the more wealthy countries like Canada and the United States have, then you get sort of a bigger bang for your buck by eliminating some of these regulatory burdens, specifically labor market frictions. And so things that I would kind of put in that bucket, right? Occupational licensing is sort of a big one. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning. Sorry, Louisiana is kind of the worst state for that, but maybe there's nowhere to go but up. But, another thing that I think about is things like, minimum wage requirements, right? Would you consider that to be a labor market restriction? Or, I would say even, some of the, certain states have experimented with, employers even on the national level, employers beyond a certain size, as measured in terms of employees, they have to provide other sort of benefits. So these are legal barriers that make it more expensive to hire people. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of on restrictions on the labor market?
Yes. So certainly within the regulation aspect, this would minimum wage laws and hiring and firing regulations. Like there's a lot of rules in. I know in the U.S., for the most part, it's a fire or hire at will kind of rules. But in other countries, especially in Europe, there's a lot of rules of, if you fire someone, you have to pay them X amount of months worth of wages, some cases up to almost a year, I believe. And this, I think, speaks even closely to income mobility itself, because if you're on the fence of hiring someone, if you know that, if it doesn't work out, you'll have to pay them a year's worth of wages. Well, for someone who doesn't have as much experience and then all things equal would have lower income at the time, you're going to be hesitant to hire that person. If you have a hire or fire or at will sort of regulations in place, you'd be more willing to take that chance to give someone a job even if they don't have the experience. So I think, specifically in this case, that would be one of the ways that income mobility would be further, or people would be more immobile in that sense. If you have these regulations in place that if you need to fire somebody for whatever reason, that you need to pay them a large amount of money, large amount of months worth of wages, you'll be pretty skeptical or cautious at least.
Yeah. Also, it's worth noting that for European countries, that sometimes these regulations are complementary in hurting people. So, for example, if you have hire and fire regulations, technically it's in a world without a minimum wage, it would be very easy for workers to offset these regulations by bidding down their entry wages, but then catching up relatively soon after. So that could be one way. But then if you put a minimum wage that's very high, you can't have these persons bidding down to get at least in an entry position. So then the minimum wage, which normally hurts people, also piles on the effect of the hire and fire regulations. Add in occupational licensing, which means you limit your options, which means that there is less competition for employees by employers, because workers have fewer outside options. Then what you can have is actually overall lower wages at the bottom of the income ladder, with lower rates of employment for unskilled workers. And in cases like this, you would get that these regulations pile on to each other. So their effect is, in a weird way, not linear. So they're kind of exponential when you're taking them as a package deal.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think lowering the cost of risk taking, in terms of hiring decisions, seems like it would tend to increase a potential for upward income mobility, particularly because that's where a lot of skills are obtained, right, and experience and all those things that are valuable, right, from a labor market perspective. Well, I want to shift gears a bit here to kind of talk about a few things that have just been on my mind a little bit and in some of the research a bit that I think that it would be helpful to kind of get your insights on. So one of them is whether or not you think that there are some what you might call diminishing returns to the positive effects of economic freedom. And kind of what I mean by that is, I'm trying to be fair and sort of steelman a position that I don't really agree with, but there's, as you might be aware, there's been sort of some discussion on what you might call the populist right or the new right or, whatever, basically where, the argument is something along the lines of disruptions caused by economic freedom, particularly free trade, have, hollowed out certain communities, certain geographical areas. And, the typical story is, okay, yes, there's going to be winners and losers. There's going to be an adjustment. Overall, we're all going to be wealthier. Capital is going to be allocated more efficiently. We don't lose that income. It just gets shifted around. But, their contention would be that the negative effects are so hard on the people that have been affected that this is now counterproductive. So that, I think that's a fair summation of the argument that's sort of happening in certain quarters of the economics, more populist right. So what would you say to that argument? Where do you think that they're getting it wrong, or do you think I formulated it incorrectly?
No, you form it as much as your formulation is fair. It is an incorrect argument.
Okay.
So when people discuss the effect, for example, of trade shocks,
yes,
the logic behind the effect of trade shocks is that there is some barriers. So imagine the example that's frequently used is China's entry in the world economy. Being such a large economy, China has a very systematic and large effect and one-time big shock on industrial patterns in Western countries. Now, normally this is not a bad thing, but it can actually be hurtful for a long period of time if workers cannot move to other industries very easily. So there must be low geographical mobility. There must be low inter-industry mobility. So it's hard to move from manufacturing to service or something like this. And these conditions that make the claim that free trade in this case would hurt are conditional in not having free markets in other dimensions. So think about what limits geographic mobility. Land use regulations in cities limit the ability of poor people to access cities for small income gains. They need to have an income gain that's large enough to pay for the higher rents and the capitalization of productivity into land prices. Remove land use regulation, and the effect of a positive trade shock vanishes, or at least diminishes. Remove barriers to entry in industries. You would have more chances of people to move to new industry, for new companies that emerge that are that now can emerge because of free trade, because resources have been liberated. They can hire the resources, capital, workers much more effectively than would have had before, but they can ramp up production faster. They can enter the market faster. And these two conditions are essentially conditions that you need economic freedom to mitigate the effect of a big shock in another dimension of economic freedom. So when you say there could be diminishing returns, my claim is actually the exact opposite. The returns of economic freedom are exponential. They're not what we would say like a concave function. They're a convex function. They will keep going up the more economic freedom you have, especially since the measure we use of economic freedom is one where we're measuring basically the absence of state interventions that into the economy. But economic freedom can actually be defined even broader than this. And this would be like the definition that philosophers use as positive freedom, which means how big is your choice set? How many options can you actually exercise? And if economic freedom generates growth, it increases the amount of choices a person can make by easing their budget constraint, by increasing the number of options they can exercise, so that would pile on to the effect of economic freedom, which is why I keep arguing. I didn't phrase it in the way you did, but I kind of like the way you phrased it, because it exemplifies kind of a dichotomy that people have, which is that they do believe that there's such a thing as too much economic freedom. And in my case, my argument is no. There is no such thing as too much economic freedom. There is no upper bound upon it, because if you allow people the freedom to create, so there is basically what we call negative freedom, in the sense that there is absence of legal constraint. Well, it allows people to create and innovate and create new technologies, new goods, new services that actually remove liberties to do certain things, because now you can exercise more option. Now you have greater sets of choices. So you keep expanding the area of choice for people. And that's why I really think it's important to negate this argument that there is such a thing as too much economic freedom. No, there isn't. There is, there is such a thing as too small a state that doesn't do its like regalian functions or stuff like that, you could say. But beyond that, no, free trade is good. Secure property rights are good. If you can make them more secure, do it. You want to remove barriers to entry. Removing barriers to entry will never be a bad thing. You want to reduce trade tariff. Reducing trade tariffs is never a bad thing, at least in the long run, right? I'm not saying that there is no adjustment cost, but these adjustment costs are going to be a function of how little freedom you have in other dimension of your life.
Okay. Justin, anything to add to that?
I don't know if I could say too much, more than that. I think Vincent had made a lot of great points there. I do agree specifically. I guess I'll more emphasize a point that I think that it's contingent, like removing, for example, if you want to put in trade barriers because, the manufacturing industry in the United States was suffered by it. Well, if you have, relatively flexible regulations in the other industries, well, then it will be easier. The adjustment costs associated with the barriers, the adjustment costs associated with these barriers are going to be smaller because you have easier options, or if you have high levels of skill that you can easily move on, and you have the opportunity to use those skills productively through loosening these regulations. I absolutely think that any harms from these trade shocks that Vincent mentioned would undoubtedly be lowered and mitigated for the most part.
Right. So let me see if I can kind of summarize this a bit. I think this resonates a lot with me, and I think you've hit on some of the big ones. Like we've talked about licensing reforms. We've talked about Vincent, you touched on land use regulations that restrict sort of physical migration. I would add one thing that jumps out to me is after the financial crisis in 2008 2009, you had a new slate of banking regulations that essentially increased dramatically the compliance costs for banks, especially giving out loans, which served to basically price out some of the more community-based banks that were the sources of capital for some of the smaller and mid-sized businesses that we had seen in parts of the United States. And so I think that's another example of sort of a restriction on economic freedom that sort of made these economies less dynamic at a time when some of these trade shocks meant that they needed to be more dynamic. So you guys are free to comment on that. I would just add that's something that it's kind of a hobby horse of mine. I think that's a fair reasoning of what happened there.
I would like to add something on this. There is, I think, a propensity amongst economists to start from what they saw in classes and just apply it to the modern world. And the thing they generally apply from modern world is markets work really, really well. But the way we teach it to each other as economists is that markets are perfect. And we do it as an abstraction to simplify things. But in reality, And when they're not perfect, it's the duty of states to intervene and resolve these problems. That's generally the way we teach it. But the problem is that that's not how the way the world works. Is the world is messy. Equilibrium is a very hard thing to reach, and there's always shocks, things that cannot be planned, contingencies that are hard, and it's the equilibrating tendencies that are important. And these equilibrating tendencies depend on the quality of institution, which means economic freedom. If there's a shock that's not foreseen, and people couldn't foresee it to some degree, and you get, say, something that's completely unexpected. Like I've done work on this that's published in Contemporary Economic Policy. A pandemic is pretty much an exogenous shock that we could not foresee. But people change their patterns of consumption during a pandemic. They start asking for, say, hand sanitizer and face masks. Well, resources that was used to produce goods before now need to be reorganized to producing goods like face masks and hand sanitizer. But we have tons and tons of examples from the pandemic that the pandemic was made worse because there were regulatory barriers to reallocating resources to other sectors. Now, what makes an economy able to withstand shock, and that's kind of you can either call it the robust or the anti-fragile contribution of economic freedom, is that it allows people to adapt to unforeseen events, to exogenous shocks, and actually withstand them and get the equilibrating forces work faster and better. So that keeps piling on onto why I say that economic freedom matters a lot in this world, is that it's what makes the equilibrating forces work well. And that makes systems that are anti-fragile or robust. For listeners who might be interested, there's a really good book by Mark Pennington of King's College London, which is, as a person who graduated from the London School of Economics, is my arch nemesis university. It's like kind of people from, I don't know, I'm thinking of Tulane versus Louisiana State. They hate each other for some reason. Anyway, not important, right? It's like stupid little rivalries. But that book, Robust Political Economy by Mark Pennington, is an amazing book about how market economies that rely more heavily on economic freedom actually are able to withstand shocks and the unexpected moments of life, whereas countries that have low economic freedom are much more fragile and much more prone to protracted crises and hurtful crises. So what could be mild shocks become more moderate or actually more stronger shocks than otherwise would be the case, whereas freer economies do better in the face of adverse situations.
And to kind of piggyback off of what Vincent said, and especially with this pandemic paper, because the thing I'm about to mention is also with the same co-author, my advisor, Jamie Bologna-Pavlik, is that in the time of crisis, we have a working paper that we've been finishing up in the last month or so that finds that during the 2008 financial crisis, which is something you were talking about a little bit earlier, Ben, is that economic freedom within the U.S., at least on a MSA level, places that had higher levels of economic freedom had less of a dip in income during the financial crisis. The unemployment rate also was lower than in places that had higher levels of economic freedom. Kind of talking to Vincent's point that in areas with high levels of economic freedom, you're able to adjust to these shocks a lot easier. You have more opportunities and abilities to respond to the times of crisis. So we find this is actually even more important during a time of crisis than just any sort of normal economic cycle. So I find that to be something that's at least interesting and stuff that I hadn't really thought about in terms of economic freedom mattering specifically in the times of crisis points. And I think these points are important findings, and I think that it does well to mention them and point out the benefits that economic freedom can have. And I guess one further point on this is that we specifically look at places that were hit the hardest, places that had the highest unemployment shocks that came about from the crisis. And we find even in those areas, within those areas, economic freedom was being able to lower the shock associated with this financial crisis. So I think everything Vincent says kind of points us in this direction of why does economic freedom matter, as a whole?
Yeah, I'm very happy to have that emphasized. I think the two things that really stand out to me from that are, first off, we know there's going to be shocks that we can't foresee. Whatever it's going to be, pandemics, droughts, I don't know. It's something that we don't even have words for yet. But we know that there's going to be shocks. There's going to be things that we can't predict. And so building institutions and systems that are able to weather and adapt to those changes really, to me anyway, it should be much more important than trying to create, Vincent, like you were saying, like some perfect equilibrium. And so getting away from that notion, and to me, that is a very anti-utopianism, right? And it's just kind of getting away from this idea that we should have that impulse to set things just perfectly, and instead we should prioritize setting up things that can adjust to something that's more dynamic and things that are unexpected, because there's always going to be those things. Is that a fair summation of some of those points that you guys were making?
Especially the word anti-utopian. That is very much a word, a descriptor I will accept.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Well, I kind of want to step back from this discussion, which I think is super helpful, to something that you had brought up a little bit earlier in terms of talking about economic freedom as a way to increase your set of choices. If you can recall that discussion that we were talking about a little while ago. One thing I hear often from some of my well-meaning peers or colleagues is that they'll accept that increasing the set of choices is something that we should really be doing. Economic freedom helps achieve that. However, there is a limit on how much economic freedom we should have, in the sense that it's preferable to tax some of that income and create sort of a universal basic income and that is a mechanism that would truly open up choices, especially for people at the bottom of the economic ladder. So it's allowing economic freedom, yes, but wouldn't also having some guaranteed level of income also increase that positive liberty, increase those sets of choices that you were talking about? How do you see that playing out in the real world? Do you think that's right? Do you think it's wrong? Is there something missing? How do you guys look at that?
So I'm not sure what Justin will say, because here I think we're on places we've discussed, he and I. So if Justin disagrees, I want to make sure I'm not speaking for him on this. Like I don't know which mind we are on this, but putting aside the guaranteed income topic, just focusing on tax and redistributing. Mm-hmm. In our work, and that part Justin and I know we agree on, is that there is ambiguous effect of government spending. Because government spending, you can use it to help the poor make investments that they could otherwise not do. But the problem is that this needs to be taxed. And the effect of the taxation can actually offset some of the benefits. And it's not clear on net which effect dominates. So if, for example, there is like one paper in the Journal of Institutional Economics that shows that economic freedom, especially the tax component, has an effect on the formation of human capital, because human capital means super large gains in income. It means that higher income tax rates are going to deter the investment in education. So it could be that, yes, we are going to tax some people from going into it, from getting degrees, from getting skills, but because we'll tax them more, and if they're even mildly risk averse, the reduction in returns that income tax rates create deters the upfront investment much more. So there's this possibility, and amongst what you call your well-meaning friends, they're correct that it could have this positive effect, but they rarely engage with the possible offset. The rest of our argument is very clear that there is no offset, right? So put aside tax rates and spending, and you concentrate on regulation and property rights, it's for sure going to have the effects of increasing mobility without the drawbacks that we mentioned. Now, the other part, if we bring in the guaranteed income discussion, and that's where I'm not sure what Justin thinks about that. I am theoretically fond of it because it implies actually that the state does only one thing and it send a check for everyone equally. It's a very strong constraint. It's a very interesting public policy. The thing is I'm also an economist and I don't engage in too much normative world building where I think, oh, this would be beautiful and I want this. And I'm quite grounded in the real that policies like this are not interesting for politicians because one of the adverse effect for politicians of a guaranteed minimum income is that if they follow the exact recommendation that comes from everyone who advances this, is that once you give it to one person, you have to give it to everyone equally. So you can't target specific groups necessary to form electoral coalitions. You can't issue pork barrel spending. You can't do X. You can't do Y. You're forced with one set of policy that's the same for everyone. And no politician likes that. And we actually have had experiments that went in the direction of doing that kind of policy. So TRA 86 in the United States, the tax reform, actually did the job of unifying the tax base, of treating everyone more equally. And it was a super big reform. And in a span of 10 years, a lot of carve-outs were remade, were reintroduced. Why? Because politicians have a tendency to use these carve-outs to secure the coalitions they need to win office. So there is, if it was ever applied as a policy, it would never yield what people who advocate it actually desire. It would simply be an addition to whatever is done now and would translate into higher tax rates. And by translating into higher tax rate could actually end up reducing the desire to make upfront investment in your skills because they're no longer worthwhile enough to spend the time, the energy, and the resources to do it. So I'm very skeptical about policies like this, even though if you put aside the real world, they're fun. But I don't put aside the real world.
So going off of this point, I think specifically on the political aspect of why it might not be, why, probably wouldn't be feasible, even if, doing what these people are arguing for doing. On the political sphere, we could look at, for example, the case of the New Deal. There's some research that was done on the New Deal and how New Deal spending was allocated. And, ideally, you would think that this New Deal spending should be sent to the places that were hit the hardest economically because they were the ones most effective. So if we were just doing it from a pure public interest standpoint, we would send that money just strictly to the hardest hit areas. What ended up finding is there was some, credence to this. They were sent to economically hard hit areas, but they were also most certainly sent to political areas of interest or areas that were either politically competitive in the sense that we really wanted, to get their votes and really needed to keep their, we wanted to build the coalition like what Vincent was talking about. So from that aspect, I think this would be one reason why politically we probably won't see something. We might not see something like this happen. Is that we don't like, or politicians don't like the just giving something to everybody and then not being able to build their own base and increase their own political utility in that sense. On the universal basic income idea specifically, I do agree with what Vincent said, even though, like he mentioned, we hadn't talked about this before. I would, without getting into too much on the details of going into it, I would point the listeners to some work that Michael Munger's done on this, saying that, okay, if you replaced UBI with the current welfare state, that would probably be better in the sense that there's, once you hit a certain threshold with this current way that the U.S. has welfare systems and a lot of other areas have welfare systems, is once you hit a threshold of income or, depending on the program, you start losing the benefits. And then that people on that margin of going from having it to not having it, you could actually end up having almost a much higher marginal effective tax rate on those people. So they don't do the things necessary to get them above that line, because it's not like they're going to all of a sudden go from $10,000 a year in income to $170,000 a year, right? Where that's obviously you would take that gain even though you'd lose all the benefits. But going from, let's say, like $15,000 to $17,000, you might not want to do it because the benefits you lose might be greater than the $2,000 gain that you have. So I think if I would just point people to that kind of to Mike Munger's work on this, because I think it's at least an interesting perspective on it. That if we would at least, if we got rid of some of the the marginal parts of this, that once you start losing the benefits after you reach a certain threshold, well, marginally we're going to respond accordingly. People respond to incentives, so the incentive would be to not increase your income in that sense, or do the things necessary to better your standing in life, which, tying it back to what we've been talking about at the beginning of the podcast, would probably limit mobility in this sense. You're not going to build the skills necessary. You're not going to go through any sort of skill development or try to get the work experience necessary to better your lot in life, because the marginal return to it might not be as high if you start losing all of these benefits because of that.
All right. Yeah, no, I think that's good. I know it's a little bit of a curveball question. It's a little far afield from what you guys had been discussing and focusing on before, but I'm the host. I get to ask whatever question I want, so I appreciate you guys rolling with it. I know we're kind of running up on our time here, so I want to be respectful of your guys' time, and I appreciate you guys coming out. There's one sort of last kind of burning question I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on, because it's something that I've been thinking about and we've been working on with some of my colleagues here at the Archbridge Institute, and that is to the extent to which there's seems to be kind of this cultural thing bubbling up. As I see it, economic freedom is really resting on sort of this implicit hope or understanding, or you might even say observation, that people will do certain things, take certain actions to better their lives and the lives of those around them. However, it does seem to me anyway, and to some other cultural commentators, that we're sort of losing that dynamic edge a bit. And to illustrate that point, you can see declines in business dynamism since roughly around the 1970s. Fewer businesses are starting than they have been in the past. Maybe that has to do with regulations. We can kind of touch on that. Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, wrote a book called The Decadent Society, where we're sort of maybe stuck in a little bit of a rut. You can see a couple other examples here I'd point to would be, male labor force participation has slowly been declining, and it continues to fall. Even more recently in the pandemic, we have a lot more job openings, at least nationally, and I think a lot of jurisdictions, we have a lot more job openings than there are people willing to fill those positions. So I guess my question, with that long stem winder of a lead up is there kind of a pathology of passivity, as Yuval Levin might talk about, that we have to contend with, where even if economic freedom is more fully realized, there's something else going on that would be preventing people from taking full advantage of those opportunities. Have you seen that at all? Is there a way that we can sort of digest that problem, or is this sort of a red herring of statistics that don't really connect very much at all?
Justin, I'm not sure exactly how to compose my thought on that. If you're more confident than I am, I'll let you go first. But if you nod your head negatively, I'll give it a stab. Okay,
it's a tough one. It's a tough one. I know.
It is a tough question. So I would go at it this way. The idea that underlies your question is that of the kind of the stagnation thesis, that we're facing declines in at least the rate at which we get better off. And the thing is I'm not convinced of that. I can see signs of things that could go better, that's for sure. But there are signs of things that go very well that we just don't measure properly. So when we do national accounting, for example, there's a lot of resources that like a capital investment that we can't measure, and these are known as intangibles. And intangibles are really, really big deal in terms of generating income, but we don't measure them properly. Like firm-specific human capital, that has value, but it can't be transferred easily. But it's also hard to measure. There's a lot of new outputs that we don't measure. So, for example, there's a quote by economic historian Joel Mokyr that goes, when we did GDP statistics, They were made for compiling wheat and iron. But today, with a lot of the services being immaterial, it's much harder to calculate them. There are ways around it. It's not that economists are idiots and they can't do it, but there is much more uncertainty in how to measure them properly. So one example I like to give to my students is if you check the sale of encyclopedias, they've gone down. There is no longer Encyclopedia Britannica being sold, even though like in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, everybody had a lot of people had the set because it was the source of information. Now there is literally zero sales of these encyclopedia, but people still consume the services of encyclopedia, and it's called Wikipedia. There's a lot of utility gains that we don't measure in their well-being that are hard to put a dollar sign on, but we see that they go up. So I think we have a downward bias. Like all the errors that we have in terms of what we have a hard time measuring go in the sense of being more optimistic rather than being less so. Now, how does that relate to economic freedom? The answer is that the more economic freedom you will have, the more option, and that goes back to the choice question you asked of us, the more choice, the greater your choice set will be, and thus the greater the likelihood that you can make choices that increase your well-being in ways that are super hard to measure. But you're still better off than if you didn't have that choice before. And a good example of this, and you can see it in the statistics, is if you check, for example, in the United States and you check income inequality, it's been rising. Even if you take the more serious numbers, so you kind of leave aside those that overestimate, so especially those that are based on tax record are generally pretty bad. I'm very skeptical of any form of inequality measurements that's based on tax data. But even if you take the most conservative measures, those that are based on consumption measures or lifetime earning inequalities, they're all going up. But at the same time, when we ask people, how happy are you? And not like day-to-day emotional happiness, but long-term life satisfaction, which is basically known as the Cantrell ladder, and how you project yourself in the future, given the path you've crossed before. So that's like, how is your global evaluation of your life path, which is a really good measure of happiness in a very global sense. That measure of happiness, the inequality in it, has actually fallen. So even though income inequality is rising, there is actually falling happiness inequality, suggesting that maybe the dollar signs that we can measure are not translating utility gains as well as before. And you can see it in the types of goods we can consume. We have now video games that do so much more than they did in the past, that it allow us to access massive communities of people that we can interact with. We have so many more options in terms of leisure that it's bound to be harder to measure. But economic freedom is going to allow you to have those exist and being exerted in two ways. One, because it's legally allowable to do so, but also because the economic growth and the improvements in productive capacities allow people to increase the number of choices they do. The fact that we spend so much time playing video games, for example, because I'm an avid gamer, is the fact that we're so productive, right? It is a resultant of the fact that we can afford leisure so much more now than before, because we get so much in an hour of work that the marginal value of an extra hour of work is incredibly lower relative to what it was before. So people now have more choice sets to maximize in different ways. And that's one of the ways economic freedom matters. But it will matter especially for people who are going to have, let me phrase it this way. In societies with very heterogeneous preferences, with people that have very different ways of finding happiness, economic freedom is going to matter so much more, because it's going to increase the choice set for them, increase the chances of them finding something that suits them. And that will be hard to measure, but it will make them happier on top of the legal ability to do so.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think Vincent made a lot of great points there. And one thing I'll mention, because Ben specifically talked about business activity, right? And presumably one of the reasons, and this I guess is part of the getting in the weeds of the data part, is that one of the reasons that we care about higher business activity or more business startups happening is presumably the reason we care is because it increases innovation. And if we take, economic growth theory seriously, one of the ways we get long run economic growth is through more ideas and more innovation. But I think just looking at, business startups, for example, while, I care about entrepreneurship and I think entrepreneurship is great, I think that just looking at that one data point would ignore a lot of innovation that would be happening within a business, right? So if you look at a place like Moderna or Pfizer, right, large companies that, just would count as one new startup if, they started today, but the innovation happening within those are, doing a lot of different things, and they're doing a lot of different innovative parts within the one organization. So I think this is where we can kind of get tricked into thinking something like this, for example. And if we look at, and kind of how it ties back to economic freedom is if we look at places or places that have higher levels of economic freedom, both within countries as well as across countries, are the places that have the most innovation. And, this could go back to the property rights part that we're talking about, that you have higher returns to the gains that you have from doing these risky innovation activities, because whenever we go into innovation, we don't know if we're going to actually reap profits from it. But if we are fairly confident, that the gains won't be taken, or that someone can't just come steal our idea or steal the property that we're doing to make the idea happen, we're going to, all things equal, marginally do more of those activities. So I think, if we this is kind of one of those areas where we can get tricked into thinking that innovation isn't happening because business startups are going down, but we need to look at a little bit more into detail of what's going on within these, within these companies or within these industries.
Yeah, I think I appreciate both you guys weighing in on that. I mean, I think that the core takeaway from me seems to be that perhaps the way that we measure and think about these things is sort of mismatched to the reality of what's going on, and the reality seems to be a bit more optimistic than it might look if you're just kind of glancing at some of these statistics. So I think that's really hopeful, and hopefully things will adjust, and the economists can maybe adjust some of their models or look at some of the different metrics as we move forward here, so that we can get a better picture of that. But I think I've got a ton of other questions for you guys, and maybe we can do this again sometime when a different paper comes out. But I really appreciate you guys coming on, talking about the paper, being willing to take some swings at some curveball questions that I had. So I really appreciate it. And if there's anything else that you think that we missed, or you think that you want to really drive home, let me know. But otherwise, we'll just have to have you guys on again and explore a few more of these topics.
Well, I guess I'll mention one quick thing, because specifically in relation to our book chapter that I think is kind of important that we didn't actually get to discuss here, is that the social mobility index that we were looking at with the World Economic Forum was looking mainly at equality of outcomes, right? So this is distinctly different. And when we talk about equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunities, so, people who might be skeptical of the role of economic freedom might also, don't want to paint with a broad brush, but would be people that might care mostly about equality of outcomes more than opportunity. So I think one of the major selling points of our finding here is that even if we're looking at equality of outcomes, we find vast benefits from economic freedom, that they're related with better health equality, better education and learning access, better technology access across different income levels within a country. Same for work opportunities and inclusive institutions. Do people feel included within a society? So even so I just wanted to point that out as I think that's one of the major benefits of the paper, is that even if we're looking at equality of outcomes, which is obviously different from the equality of opportunities that I know Gonzalo and other people who write for the Archbridge talk about, that even if we look at equality of outcomes, economic freedom still has an important predictor there.
Yeah, no, that's a key point. That's a key point to keep in mind. And I think that one that is often missed by some of the proponents of a bit more, less economic freedom in the service of those more equal outcomes. So I think that's always something really good to highlight. Well, with that, I'll cut off the recording here and just say again, thank you guys both for coming on, and it'd be a pleasure to have you guys on again some other time in the future.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us. It was a really great time. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.